The fluorescent lights of the VA Medical Center cast harsh shadows across Dr. Sarah Chen's face as she methodically cleaned the examination room. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, each motion calculated to maintain the sterile environment that had become her sanctuary. The antiseptic smell filled her nostrils, a scent that once brought comfort but now served as a constant reminder of battles fought both on foreign soil and within the confines of her own mind. Sarah had been working at the Denver Veterans Affairs Medical Center for 3 years, ever since her medical discharge from the Navy. To her colleagues, she was the quiet Asian woman who kept to herself, always arriving early and leaving late. They knew she had served overseas, but the details remained locked away behind her professional demeanor and carefully constructed walls. The morning started like any other. Sarah reviewed patient files in the break room, sipping black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The familiar routine provided structure to days that otherwise felt like an endless loop of treating wounds while ignoring her own. Dr. Martinez, the chief of staff, approached with a clipboard and the weary expression of someone who had seen too much human suffering. "Sarah, we have a situation in Trauma Bay 3, he said, his voice carrying the weight of urgency. "Multiple casualties coming in from a training accident at Fort Carson. ETA, 5 minutes. Sarah nodded, setting down her coffee cup with steady hands that betrayed none of the sudden spike in her heart rate. Training accidents were different from combat casualties, she told herself. This was Colorado, not Afghanistan. These were soldiers in a controlled environment, not Marines bleeding out in the desert sand while mortars exploded overhead. The ambulance sirens grew louder as Sarah made her way to the trauma bay, her footsteps echoing in the sterile corridors. She pulled on fresh gloves and checked the equipment one final time, falling into the rhythm that had kept her alive and kept others alive in places where death lurked around every corner. The first stretcher wheeled through the doors carried a young soldier, barely out of high school by the look of him. Shrapnel wounds peppered his left side, and his eyes held the glazed expression of shock that Sarah recognized all too well. She moved with practiced efficiency, assessing vitals and directing the nurses with calm authority. "What's his name?" she asked the paramedic while examining the wounds. "Private Johnson, ma'am." Live fire exercise went wrong when an explosive malfunctioned. Sarah's hands never paused in their work, but something cold settled in her stomach. Live fire exercises. Explosives. The words triggered a cascade of memories she had spent years trying to suppress. The sound of incoming mortars. The acrid smell of smoke and cordite. The weight of her rifle in her hands as she worked to save lives while bullets whistled overhead. The second casualty arrived as Sarah was stabilizing the first. This one was worse. A staff sergeant with severe burns and internal injuries from blast. As the trauma team worked frantically to save his life, Sarah found herself slipping into a different mindset, one she had cultivated in the mountains of Afghanistan, where death was always one heartbeat away. Her movements became more fluid, more instinctive. Years of training as a Navy hospital corpsman attached to Marine units kicked in, overriding the careful civilian persona she had constructed. She barked orders with an authority that surprised the nursing staff, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision. "I need 2 units of ONEG stat. Give me a chest tube kit and prep for emergency surgery," she commanded, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had performed these procedures under enemy fire. Dr. Martinez watched from across the room, his eyebrows raised at the transformation. The quiet, reserved Dr. Chun had vanished, replaced by someone who moved with the deadly efficiency of a combat veteran. There was something in her eyes now, a hardness that spoke of experiences beyond the sterile confines of civilian medicine. The third casualty pushed Sarah closer to the edge she had been carefully avoiding for 3 years. A young Marine, because despite being Army, all wounded soldiers looked like Marines to her, with a traumatic amputation of his left leg. The sight of the mangled limb sent her spiraling back to a dusty forward operating base, where she had held a similar Marine as his life ebbed away. whispering promises she couldn't keep about going home to his girl back in Ohio. Sarah's hands shook almost imperceptibly as she applied the tourniquet, the muscle memory of countless similar procedures taking over even as her mind threatened to fracture. She could hear the distant rumble of helicopters, not medevac birds coming to save lives, but the phantom echoes of Chinooks and Black Hawks that haunted her dreams. "Doc, you okay?" asked Nurse Thompson, a veteran herself who recognized the signs. Sarah forced herself to focus on the present, on the beeping monitors and sterile environment of the trauma bay. This wasn't Afghanistan. These soldiers would live to see another day, to hug their families and sleep in their own beds. She wouldn't lose anyone on her watch, not again. The fourth patient nearly broke her carefully maintained composure. A female soldier, roughly Sarah's age, with burns covering 40% of her body. As Sarah worked to stabilize her vitals, the woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware enough to register pain and fear. "Doc," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "Am I going to make it?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. How many times had she been asked that same question in forward aid stations and field hospitals? How many times had she lied with a smile, telling scared kids that everything would be fine when she knew they had minutes left to live? "You're going to be fine," Sarah heard herself say, the words automatic after years of practice. But this time she meant it. This time, she had the resources and the environment to make good on that promise. As the trauma team worked to stabilize all four patients, Sarah found herself operating on pure instinct. Her movements were economical, precise, honed by years of working under the worst possible conditions. She anticipated needs before they arose, directed resources with tactical efficiency, and maintained situational awareness that impressed even the most experienced staff. Dr. Martinez pulled her aside as the last patient was wheeled to surgery. "Sarah, I've never seen you work like that before. Where did that come from?" Sarah stripped off her blood-stained gloves, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Just training, sir. Navy taught us to work under pressure." But they both knew it was more than that. The woman who had just saved 4 lives wasn't just a former Navy medic. She was someone who had seen real combat, who had made life and death decisions under conditions that would break most people. The afternoon brought a new challenge in the form of Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a Navy SEAL who had been involved in the training accident. Unlike the others, his wounds were psychological rather than physical, a concussion and severe anxiety from being caught in the blast. He sat on the examination table, his eyes darting constantly around the room, hyper-vigilant in the way that only combat veterans understood. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. The tight jaw, the clenched fists, the way he positioned himself with a clear view of all exits. She had seen it in the mirror countless times during her own darkest moments. "Chief, I'm DR. Chun," she said, approaching slowly and keeping her hands visible. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, Doc," Rodriguez replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the storm raging beneath the surface. "But I've had worse." As Sarah examined him, checking for signs of traumatic brain injury, she noticed the tattoos covering his arms. Unit insignia, deployment dates, and memorial pieces for fallen teammates. Her own hidden tattoos seemed to burn beneath her lab coat, ink that told a similar story of brotherhood, loss, and survival. "You deployed recently?" she asked, keeping her voice professionally neutral while checking his pupil response. "Afghanistan, 2019 to 2020. Helmand Province mostly. You know how it is, document." Sarah's hands paused for just a moment. Helmand Province. She had spent 8 months in that same hellish landscape, treating Marines who had stepped on IEDs and taken sniper rounds while conducting village medical outreach programs. The memories came flooding back, the taste of dust, the sound of incoming fire, the weight of responsibility for keeping Marines alive long enough to get them to proper medical care. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know how it is." Something in her tone made Rodriguez look at her more carefully. His trained, I took in details that civilians would miss, The way she moved with tactical awareness, the slight callus on her trigger finger that never quite faded, the way her eyes automatically tracked movement in the room. "You serve, Doc." Sarah hesitated. She had spent 3 years avoiding this conversation, deflecting questions about her service with vague references to medical training and overseas deployment. But something about Rodriguez's direct gaze and the shared understanding between veterans made her usual evasions feel inadequate. "Navy hospital corpsman," she admitted, "attached to 3rd Marines." Rodriguez's expression shifted immediately. Navy corpsmen who served with Marine units were legendary among Special Operations Forces. They were the ones who ran into gunfire to treat wounded Marines, who performed surgery under enemy fire, who carried rifles in one hand and medical bags in the other. "3rd Marines," he repeated, respect clear in his voice. "You saw some shit over there, document." Sarah finished her examination in silence, the weight of shared experience hanging between them. She had indeed seen things that haunted her dreams and shaped every moment of her waking life. The difference was that Rodriguez still carried himself like a warrior, while she had tried to bury that part of herself beneath white coats and medical degrees. As the day wore on, word of Sarah's performance during the mass casualty event spread through the hospital. Nurses who had worked with her for years looked at her with new eyes, seeing glimpses of the combat medic beneath the reserved exterior. Dr. Martinez made a note in her personnel file about exceptional performance under pressure, but he sensed there was much more to the story. The evening shift brought a moment of quiet reflection as Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, unwilling to go home to her empty apartment where the silence would allow the memories to surface. She thought about Rodriguez's question and her own carefully constructed answer. Navy hospital corpsman attached to 3rd Marines. It sounded so clinical, so sanitized compared to the reality of what that had meant. She remembered the first time she had to pick up a rifle in combat, when the patrol she was with had been ambushed, and she had to provide covering fire while treating wounded Marines. She remembered the weight of that weapon, so different from the medical instruments she was trained to use. But she had learned that sometimes healing required violence, that protecting life sometimes meant taking it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in California, checking in as she did every week since Sarah's discharge. The messages were always the same: gentle inquiries about work, invitations to visit, concerns about Sarah's isolation. Her family knew she had served as a medic, but they had no idea about the combat operations, the firefights, the nights when she had held dying Marines, and tried to convince them they would see home again. Sarah started her car and drove through the Denver streets, passing by neighborhoods where families were settling down for dinner, where the biggest crisis might be homework help or bedtime stories. She envied their normalcy, even as she knew she could never truly be part of it. The day's events had stripped away layers of carefully constructed civilian identity, revealing the warrior medic she had tried so hard to leave behind. At home, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and slowly unbuttoned her lab coat. Beneath the professional exterior, tattoos told the story she had never spoken aloud. A caduceus wrapped with a Marine Corps emblem on her shoulder. Coordinates marking the location where she had saved her first life under fire. A memorial piece for Doc Harrison, the corpsman who had taught her how to stay alive and keep others alive in the worst conditions imaginable. She had thought she could leave that life behind, that she could become just another civilian doctor treating routine ailments and minor emergencies. But today had proven that some experiences change you at a cellular level, that some skills never fade, that some responsibilities never truly end. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision she had been avoiding for 3 years. Tomorrow, she would call the VA counselor she had been recommended to see since her discharge. Not because she was breaking down, but because she was finally ready to acknowledge that being wounded didn't make you weak, and being silent didn't make the past disappear. The last thing she saw before turning off the lights was her Navy Cross, mounted in a frame on her dresser. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism under enemy fire and life-saving actions performed at great personal risk. She had earned it during her third deployment, on a day when everything had gone wrong, and she had been the only thing standing between a squad of wounded Marines and certain death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to heal. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Chun allowed herself to remember that she was more than just a doctor. She was a warrior who had chosen to heal instead of harm, a guardian who had traded her rifle for a stethoscope but had never stopped fighting the good fight. The hospital would never be the same after today, and neither would she. The mask had slipped, the walls had cracked, and glimpses of the real Sarah Chun had emerged. Whether that was a good thing or a catastrophe remained to be seen, but there was no going back to the careful anonymity she had cultivated. In her dreams that night, she was back in Afghanistan, but this time she wasn't running from the memories. This time, she was embracing them, accepting them as part of who she had become. The wounded could heal, but the scars would always remain. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly as it should be. The morning after the mass casualty event dawned gray and cold over Denver, matching the emotional weather inside Sarah's mind. She had barely slept, her dreams filled with the familiar cocktail of morphine-hazed memories and the sharp clarity of yesterday's crisis. When her alarm sounded at 0500, she was already awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the woman she had been yesterday with the careful facade she had maintained for 3 years. The drive to the hospital took her past the same landmarks she navigated every day, the coffee shop where she never stopped, the park where she never walked, the community center where she never engaged with her neighbors. But today, these ordinary places felt different, as if yesterday's revelation had shifted the lens through which she viewed the world. Dr. Martinez was waiting for her in his office when she arrived, 2 cups of coffee steaming on his desk, and a folder of paperwork that looked ominous. Sarah knocked on the open door frame, her stomach tight with the familiar anxiety that came with being called to the principal's office, even as an adult. Sara, come in. Close the door behind you. She settled into the chair across from his desk, accepting the offered coffee with hands that only trembled slightly. Martinez studied her with the calculating gaze of a physician assessing symptoms. But there's also warmth there, the concern of a colleague who had watched her struggle with demons she refused to name. Yesterday was exceptional, he began, consulting the folder. Exceptional in ways that have me asking questions I should have asked 3 years ago when you started here. Sarah remained silent, falling back on the old military maxim that it was better to let the other person talk first. Martinez seemed to understand her reticence, and continued without waiting for a response. I've been reviewing your file, Sarah. Your medical credentials are impeccable, your performance evaluations consistently excellent, but there are gaps. Significant gaps that suggest your military service was far more extensive than what's documented in your civilian medical history. He opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. Sarah recognized her own handwriting on the employment application, the careful omissions and artful misdirections she had crafted to present herself as just another former military medic seeking civilian employment. You listed your Navy service as hospital corpsman, overseas deployment, but you didn't mention the Navy Cross in your personnel file. You didn't mention the combat medical badge or the Purple Heart. You certainly didn't mention that you were attached to Marine units conducting combat operations in some of the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan. Sarah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet office. Martinez had done his homework, probably making calls to contacts in military medicine who could fill in the blanks she had deliberately left empty. I didn't think it was relevant to my civilian medical practice, she said finally, her voice carefully modulated to project calm professionalism. Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression gentle but persistent. Sarah, yesterday you performed combat triage with a level of skill and instinct that doesn't come from textbooks. You commanded a trauma team like you've been doing it under enemy fire, which I'm now beginning to suspect you have. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and carefully guarded secrets. Sarah had spent 3 years building walls around her past, and now this kind man was methodically dismantling them with facts and genuine concern. "What happened over there, Sarah? What are you running from?" The question hit her like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was asked with such gentle understanding. Martinez had served as an army medic during the First Gulf War. He understood the particular burden carried by those who had to heal in the midst of destruction. "I'm not running from anything," Sarah replied, but even she could hear the lie in her voice. "I'm just trying to move forward." Forward from what? The simple question opened a crack in the carefully constructed dam, holding back 3 years of suppressed memories. Sarah found herself remembering Staff Sergeant Williams, the Marine who had taken a sniper's bullet to the chest during a village medical outreach program. She had worked on him for 40 minutes while under sporadic enemy fire, finally getting him stable enough for medevac, only to watch the helicopter take ground fire and crash 2 miles from the landing zone. Williams had died that day, along with 2 other Marines and the Navy pilot who had risked everything to try to save them. Sarah had walked back to the forward operating base carrying Williams' dog tags and a letter he had written to his daughter, a letter she still kept in her desk drawer at home because she had never been able to bring herself to mail it. "Dr. Chun," Martinez's voice pulled her back to the present, to the sterile office with its motivational posters and medical journals. "Are you with me?" Sarah blinked, realizing that tears were threatening to spill over. She had not cried since her discharge ceremony, had not allowed herself that luxury or weakness. "I'm fine, just tired from yesterday." Martinez closed the folder and leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Sarah, I'm not asking these questions to embarrass you or to invade your privacy. I'm asking because I care about you as both a colleague and a human being. What happened yesterday was remarkable, but it also revealed someone who has been hiding a significant part of herself." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think you might be ready to stop hiding." Before Sarah could respond, her pager buzzed with an emergency code. "Mass casualty event, multiple trauma patients incoming." The same code that had transformed her world 24 hours earlier was calling again, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the prospect of battle. "We'll continue this later," Martinez said, standing as alarms began sounding throughout the hospital. "But Sarah, yesterday showed me who you really are. Don't go back to hiding from that person." The trauma bay was organized chaos as the first ambulances arrived. This time it was a multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 25, involving a convoy of military vehicles returning from training exercises. Sarah found herself once again working alongside Chief Rodriguez, who had insisted on staying at the hospital despite his concussion to help with the emergency response. "Thought you might want backup, Doc," he said, appearing at her elbow as she prepared to receive the first casualty. "Turns out we make a good team." The first patient was a young soldier with crush injuries from being trapped in an overturned vehicle. As Sarah assessed his condition, Rodriguez worked seamlessly alongside her, anticipating her needs and providing assistance with the intuitive teamwork of experienced combat veterans. "Possible internal bleeding, probable spleen laceration," Sarah called out, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "I need 2 large-bore IVs and type and cross for 6 units." "Copy that, Doc," Rodriguez replied, already reaching for the equipment. "Vitals are stable, but trending down. We need to move fast." Working with Rodriguez felt natural in a way that civilian medical practice never had. He understood the urgency, the calculated risks, the way priorities shifted in real time based on changing conditions. More importantly, he understood the weight of responsibility that came with holding another person's life in your hands. The second casualty tested Sarah's carefully maintained composure. A female soldier, barely 20 years old, with severe head trauma from the accident. As Sarah worked to stabilize her, the young woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and frightened. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "I want to go home." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, transporting her back to a dusty aid station where Lance Corporal Martinez, no relation to her supervisor, had whispered the same words as she tried to stop the bleeding from his femoral artery. He had been 19 years old, from a small town in Texas, and he had died calling for his mother while Sarah held pressure on a wound that wouldn't close. Sarah's hands began to shake as she worked, muscle memory warring with emotional overload. Rodriguez noticed immediately, stepping closer and placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Stay with me, Doc," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had talked teammates through countless crisis situations. "Focus on what you can control." The simple words cut through the chaos in Sarah's mind, grounding her in the present moment. She took a deep breath, pushed the memories aside, and returned her attention to the young soldier who needed her skills, not her trauma. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Working with Rodriguez felt like being part of a team again, part of something larger than herself. The isolation she had cultivated for 3 years began to feel less like protection and more like self-imposed exile. During a brief lull between patients, Rodriguez pulled her aside. "Doc, can I ask you something?" Sarah nodded, too emotionally drained to maintain her usual guardedness. "Yesterday, you said you were attached to 3rd Marines. Which battalion?" 3-7, Sarah replied automatically, then caught herself. She had never told anyone the specific unit designation, another detail she had kept locked away. Rodriguez's expression shifted to something approaching awe. 3-7. The Desperados. You were with them during Operation Steel Curtain. Sarah's blood ran cold. Operation Steel Curtain had been a classified mission, a joint operation involving Marines and Navy SEALs to eliminate a high-value target in the mountains of Helmand Province. It had gone wrong in every possible way, resulting in a 3-day running firefight that had tested every skill she possessed as a combat medic. "How do you know about Steel Curtain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rodriguez looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "Because I was there too, Document SEAL Team 6, providing overwatch and extraction support. I remember hearing about a Navy corpsman who kept a squad of Marines alive for 3 days while calling in airstrikes and performing field surgery." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Rodriguez had been there, had witnessed the worst days of her military career from a different vantage point. The days when she had been forced to make impossible decisions, when she had learned that healing sometimes required killing, when she had discovered reserves of strength and determination she had never known she possessed. "You were Ghost 7, she said, remembering the call sign of the SEAL Overwatch team that had provided sniper support during the final day of the operation. "And you were Angel 6, Rodriguez replied, the medic who refused evacuation until every wounded Marine was accounted for. They stared at each other across the trauma bay. Two veterans who had shared one of the most harrowing experiences of their military careers without ever meeting face to face. The weight of that shared history settled between them, creating an instant bond forged in combat and tempered by survival. "I heard you earned the Navy Cross for that operation," Rodriguez continued. "Heard you carried Sergeant Morrison for 2 miles while under fire to get him to the landing zone." Sarah's throat tightened. Morrison had survived, barely, spending 8 months in military hospitals learning to walk again after taking shrapnel to his spine. She had visited him during his recovery, watching him struggle through physical therapy while maintaining the Marine Corps optimism that refused to acknowledge defeat. "We all did our jobs," Sarah said, falling back on the standard deflection that had served her well for years. Rodriguez shook his head. "No, document. Some people do their jobs. Others become legends. What you did during Steel Curtain, that's the kind of thing that gets talked about in briefing rooms for years afterward." Before Sarah could respond, another wave of casualties arrived, demanding their immediate attention. But something had shifted between them, a recognition of shared experience that went beyond professional respect. Rodriguez had seen her at her worst and her best, had witnessed the crucible that had forged the woman she had become. As they worked together to treat the new patients, Sarah felt something loosening inside her chest, a knot of tension that had been there for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight. For the first time in 3 years, she was working with someone who understood not just her skills, but the context in which those skills had been earned. The afternoon brought a new challenge in the form of Dr. Patricia Webb, a psychiatrist from the VA who had come to evaluate the psychological impact of the recent mass casualty events on the hospital staff. Dr. Webb was a veteran herself, an Army psychiatrist who specialized in combat-related trauma, and she had a reputation for seeing through the careful facades that veterans constructed to hide their pain. "Dr. Chun," she said, approaching Sarah during a quiet moment in the trauma bay. "I understand you were instrumental in managing yesterday's emergency response. I'd like to speak with you about how you're processing the experience." Sarah's defenses immediately went up. She had spent 3 years avoiding VA psychiatrists, convinced that any admission of psychological struggle would be seen as weakness or, worse, would result in restrictions on her medical license. "I'm fine, Dr. Webb. Just doing my job." Dr. Webb smiled, the knowing expression of someone who had heard that phrase countless times from veterans who were anything but fine. "Dr. Chun, I've been treating combat veterans for 15 years. I know the difference between someone who is actually fine and someone who has become very good at appearing fine." She gestured toward a quiet consultation room. "I'm not here to evaluate your fitness for duty or to make any determinations about your mental health. I'm here because I understand that yesterday's events may have triggered some difficult memories for our veteran staff members." Reluctantly, Sarah followed Dr. Webb into the consultation room, taking a seat across from the older woman who radiated the calm competence of someone comfortable with difficult conversations. "Tell me about yesterday," Dr. Webb began, her voice gentle but persistent. Not the medical facts, but how it felt to be back in that environment. Sarah stared at her hands, noting the slight tremor that had developed over the past few days. It felt familiar, like muscle memory taking over. Familiar how? Like being back in a forward aid station. Multiple casualties, limited resources, life and death decisions every few minutes. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I suppose it reminded me of my time overseas." Dr. Webb leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about overseas." The simple request opened floodgates that Sarah had kept sealed for years. She found herself talking about Afghanistan, about the daily reality of treating wounded Marines while under enemy fire, about the weight of responsibility that came with being the only medical support for miles in any direction. She talked about the impossible decisions, the times when she had to choose which wounded soldier to treat first, knowing that the others might die while she worked. She talked about the guilt of surviving when others didn't, about the nightmares that had followed her home, about the way civilian life had felt impossibly fragile and meaningless after the intensity of combat medicine. "I try to leave it all behind," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "I thought if I could just be a regular doctor treating regular patients, I could forget about the war. But yesterday showed me that I can't separate who I am from what I experienced over there." Dr. Webb nodded with understanding. "Trauma doesn't exist in a vacuum, Dr. Chun. It becomes part of who we are, part of our neural pathways and emotional responses. The goal isn't to forget or to separate yourself from those experiences. It's to integrate them in a healthy way." She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "What I saw yesterday, based on the reports I've received, wasn't trauma reaction. It was competence. It was someone drawing on their most challenging experiences to excel in a crisis situation." The observation caught Sarah off guard. She had spent 3 years viewing her combat experience as something to be overcome, a source of shame and dysfunction. The idea that it could be a source of strength, a valuable part of her identity as a physician, was revolutionary. "You're suggesting I stop trying to hide from my military service?" "I'm suggesting you stop viewing it as something to hide from," Dr. Webb replied. "Your combat experience doesn't disqualify you from being an effective civilian physician. It enhances your abilities. The question is whether you're ready to acknowledge that integration." As the conversation continued, Sarah felt the careful walls she had constructed beginning to crumble. Dr. Webb didn't judge her experiences or suggest that she was broken because of them. Instead, she helped Sarah see that the skills and instincts that had kept Marines alive in Afghanistan were the same qualities that made her an exceptional emergency physician. The day ended with Sarah standing in the hospital parking lot, processing everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. Rodriguez appeared beside her, also finishing his extended shift helping with the emergency response. "Hell of a couple days, Doc," he said, lighting a cigarette with hands that showed the slight tremor of exhaustion. "Yeah," Sarah replied, watching the Denver skyline as the sun set behind the mountains. "Hell of a couple days." They stood in comfortable silence, two veterans who had found an unexpected connection in the sterile corridors of a civilian hospital. Finally, Rodriguez spoke again. "You know, Doc, for what it's worth, I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Yesterday showed me that some people are called to heal, whether that's in a foxhole in Afghanistan or a trauma bay in Denver." Sarah looked at him, seeing not just a fellow veteran, but a reflection of her own journey from warrior to healer. "Thanks, Chief. That means more than you know." As she drove home, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. She was going to stop running from who she had been and start embracing who she had become. The wounded could heal, but the scars were part of the story. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start telling that story. 3 weeks had passed since the double mass casualty events that had shattered Sarah's carefully constructed anonymity. The hospital felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of awareness that Dr. Chun was more than the quiet physician who kept to herself. Word had spread through the medical community about her exceptional performance during the emergencies, and with it came questions, recognition, and an uncomfortable level of attention. Sarah arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, seeking the solitude of empty corridors before the day shift arrived. She had been sleeping poorly, her dreams filled with a confusing mixture of memories from Afghanistan and recent events at the hospital. The line between past and present was blurring in ways that both terrified and liberated her. Dr. Martinez had been true to his word about continuing their conversation, but he had approached the subject with the patience of someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. Their talks had become a regular part of Sarah's week, informal sessions in his office where she found herself gradually opening up about her military service and the reason she had tried so hard to leave it behind. This morning, however, brought an unexpected challenge. Sarah found a visitor waiting in the trauma bay, a tall, weathered man in his 50s wearing a Marine Corps jacket and carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. When he turned to face her, Sarah recognized him immediately and felt her heart stop. Colonel James Morrison stood before her, older and grayer than when she had last seen him 8 years ago, but unmistakably the same man who had commanded the Marine Battalion during Operation Steel Curtain. The man whose son, Sergeant David Morrison, she had carried 2 miles through enemy territory to save his life. "Doc," Morrison said, his voice carrying the same commanding presence she remembered from briefings in dusty command tents. "Been looking for you for a long time." Sarah's mouth went dry. She had not spoken to anyone connected to her military service since her discharge, had deliberately severed all ties to avoid the painful memories and complicated emotions that came with her time in Afghanistan. Seeing Morrison here, in her civilian sanctuary, felt like a collision between 2 worlds she had tried desperately to keep separate. "Colonel Morrison," she managed, falling automatically into military bearing despite her civilian clothes. "Sir, what are you doing here?" Morrison smiled, the expression softening features that had been hardened by decades of military service. "Retired now, document. It's just Jim. And I'm here because I finally tracked down the woman who saved my boy's life." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had tried for years to forget that David Morrison had survived, that her actions during those terrible 3 days had actually meant something beyond the immediate tactical situation. The guilt of all the Marines she couldn't save had overshadowed the knowledge that some had lived because of her skills and determination. "How is David?" she asked, the question emerging before she could stop herself. "Married, 2 kids, works as a park ranger in Montana," Morrison replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Walks with a limp, but he walks. Has a good life because of what you did for him." Sarah felt tears threatening and turned away, busying herself with checking equipment that didn't need checking. The simple fact of David Morrison's survival, his normal, happy civilian life, was almost too much to process. She had carried so much guilt about the Marines who didn't make it home that she had never allowed herself to take comfort in the ones who did. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she said, falling back on the familiar deflection. Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to the gentle tone she remembered him using when addressing wounded Marines. "Doc, what you did during Steel Curtain went so far beyond anyone's job description that it's still talked about in Marine Corps schools as an example of extraordinary courage under fire." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. "David wanted me to give you this. He's been carrying it for 8 years, waiting for the day he could find you and say thank you." Sarah opened the box with trembling hands and found David Morrison's Purple Heart Medal, the one he had earned for wounds received in action during Operation Steel Curtain. Beneath, it was a handwritten note that made her vision blur with unshed tears. "Doc Angel, you carried me when I couldn't walk, fought for me when I couldn't fight, and brought me home when I thought I was going to die in that godforsaken valley. I can never repay what you did, but I can live the best life possible in honor of your courage. Thank you for giving me a chance to meet my wife, to hold my children, to see sunrises over the Montana mountains. You are the guardian angel who made all of it possible. Semper Fi, David Morrison." Sarah closed the box carefully, her hands shaking as she processed the weight of what she held. The Purple Heart represented not just David's sacrifice, but her own as well, the prices they had both paid for his survival, the scars they both carried from those terrible days in the mountains. "He wanted to come himself," Morrison continued, "but he thought it might be too much for both of you. David struggles with survivor's guilt document. He knows that other Marines didn't make it home, and he carries that weight. But he also knows that his survival meant something, that his life has purpose because of what you did." The parallel between David's survivor's guilt and her own was not lost on Sarah. She had spent 8 years focusing on the Marines she couldn't save while ignoring the ones she had. The realization that David Morrison was living a full, meaningful life because of her actions during Steel Curtain was both healing and overwhelming. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why come looking for me after all these years?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "Because word got out in military medical circles about what happened here a few weeks ago. A former Navy corpsman performing combat triage in a civilian hospital, working with the kind of skill and instinct that only comes from real combat experience. It didn't take long for people to start connecting the dots." He paused, studying Sarah's face with the calculating gaze of a career officer assessing a subordinate. "There are people who remember what you did over there, document. People who think your skills are being wasted in a civilian hospital when you could be training the next generation of combat medics." The suggestion hit Sarah like cold water. The idea of returning to the military environment, even as an instructor, was both terrifying and oddly appealing. She had found purpose in her civilian medical practice, but it lacked the intensity and immediate importance of combat medicine. Before she could respond, Chief Rodriguez appeared in the trauma bay, drawn by the sight of an unfamiliar man in military attire talking to Sarah. His presence reminded Sarah that her carefully guarded past was no longer a secret, at least not to those who had served in similar circumstances. "Chief Rodriguez," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption, "I'd like you to meet Colonel Morrison, retired Marines." "Sir, this is Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Navy SEALs." The two men shook hands with the easy recognition of fellow warriors, immediately falling into the comfortable dynamic of military professionals. Rodriguez's presence seemed to validate Morrison's assessment of Sarah's current situation. She was not just hiding from her past. but she was finding her way back to her true calling through connections with other veterans. "Chief," Morrison said, "I was just telling Doc Shin here about some opportunities in military medical training that might be of interest to someone with her background." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow, looking between Morrison and Sarah with obvious curiosity. "What kind of opportunities?" "The Navy is developing a new combat medic training program," Morrison explained. "They need instructors who have real combat experience, who can teach the next generation of corpsmen not just the medical procedures but the psychological and tactical aspects of battlefield medicine." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The prospect of returning to the military environment, even as a civilian contractor, brought up complex emotions she wasn't sure she was ready to process. Part of her longed for the sense of purpose and belonging she had found in her military service, but another part feared that going back would undo the healing she had achieved in civilian life. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of commitment," Sarah said carefully. Morrison nodded with understanding. "I'm not asking for a decision today, document. I'm just planting a seed. David wanted me to tell you that your service mattered, that the Marines you saved went on to live meaningful lives. But there's another generation of corpsmen who need to learn what you know, who could benefit from your experience." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Webb, the VA psychiatrist who had become a regular presence in Sarah's life over the past few weeks. Her sessions with Dr. Webb had been helping Sarah process her military experiences in a healthier way, but she hadn't yet discussed the possibility of returning to a military environment. "Dr. Chin," Dr. Webb said, then noticed Morrison and Rodriguez. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "Dr. Webb," Sarah said, "this is Colonel Morrison and Chief Rodriguez. We were just discussing some potential career opportunities." Dr. Webb's expression shifted to professional interest. She had been working with Sarah to integrate her military experience with her civilian identity, and the appearance of figures from Sarah's past represented a significant development in that process. "Would it be helpful to discuss these opportunities in a more structured setting?" Dr. Webb asked. "Sometimes major career decisions benefit from professional guidance, especially for veterans who are processing complex relationships with their military service." Morrison looked at Sarah questioningly, clearly recognizing that Dr. Webb was more than a casual colleague. Sarah realized that this was a moment of truth. She could continue to compartmentalize her life, keeping her civilian and military identities separate, or she could begin the more difficult work of integration. "That might be helpful," Sarah admitted. "Dr. Webb has been working with me on processing my military experiences." The admission represented a significant step forward in Sarah's healing process. For the first time, she was acknowledging her need for support rather than maintaining the facade of complete self-sufficiency that had characterized her civilian life. Dr. Webb suggested they continue the conversation in a conference room where they could speak more privately. As they settled around the table, Sarah found herself sitting between her military past, represented by Morrison and Rodriguez, and her civilian present, represented by Dr. Webb. The positioning felt symbolic of the integration she was trying to achieve. "Tell me about these opportunities," Dr. Webb said, addressing Morrison but keeping her attention focused on Sarah's reactions. Morrison outlined the Navy's new combat medic training program, explaining the need for instructors who could combine advanced medical skills with real combat experience. The program would involve teaching at the Navy's Medical Training Center in San Diego, developing curriculum based on lessons learned from recent conflicts, and mentoring young corpsmen preparing for deployment. The position would be civilian contractor status, Morrison explained, so you'd maintain your independence while contributing to military readiness. But it would mean acknowledging your military service in a very public way. The last comment hit home for Sarah. Taking such a position would mean the end of her anonymity, the final abandonment of her attempt to leave her military identity behind. Everyone would know that Dr. Chun was a decorated combat veteran, and that knowledge would change how she was perceived both professionally and personally. Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression serious. "Doc, can I say something as someone who's been where you are?" Sarah nodded, recognizing the weight of shared experience in his voice. I spent 2 years after my last deployment trying to convince myself that I was just another civilian, Rodriguez said. Try to pretend that my time in the teams was just a job I used to have, something I could file away and forget about. But the truth is, those experiences made me who I am. They gave me skills and perspectives that the civilian world needs. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What I've seen working with you these past few weeks is someone who's ready to stop hiding from who she is. You're not just a good doctor, Doc. You're a warrior who chose healing over destruction. That's not something to be ashamed of. Dr. Webb had been listening carefully to the conversation, observing Sarah's body language and emotional responses. Sarah, how does this conversation feel to you? What emotions are coming up? Sarah took a moment to examine her internal state, applying the mindfulness techniques Dr. Webb had been teaching her. Scared, she admitted. Excited. Confused. Like standing at the edge of a cliff, wondering whether to jump or step back. Those are normal responses to major life transitions, Dr. Webb said. The question is whether you're avoiding the jump because of genuine concerns or because of unprocessed trauma. Morrison had been quietly observing the exchange, his experienced eye taking in the dynamics between Sarah and her support network. Doc, he said finally, I'm not here to pressure you into anything. But I want you to know that David isn't the only Marine whose life you saved over there. There are dozens of them scattered all over the country, living full lives because of what you did. He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a group photo from a recent Marine Corps reunion. 15 Marines from our battalion who made it home from Afghanistan. Half of them owe their lives to your skills and courage. Sarah stared at the photo, recognizing faces despite the passage of years. These men had families now, careers, children who would never know how close they had come to growing up without fathers. The weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that her actions had ripple effects through generations, was almost overwhelming. They wanted me to tell you something, Morrison continued. They don't need you to carry their guilt about the Marines who didn't make it home. What they need is for you to carry their gratitude, their respect, and their belief that your skills and experience can continue to save lives. The words cut through Sarah's carefully constructed emotional defenses. For 8 years, she had focused on her failures, on the Marines she couldn't save, on the weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances. The idea that survivors might actually need her to succeed, to thrive, to continue using her skills to help others, was revolutionary. As the meeting concluded, Morrison left his contact information and a packet of materials about the training program. Think about it, Doc, he said as he prepared to leave. But remember, some people are called to serve in different ways throughout their lives. Your service didn't end when you left the military. It just evolved. After Morrison left, Sarah found herself alone with Dr. Webb and Rodriguez. The weight of the conversation, the memories it had stirred up, and the decisions it demanded felt enormous. What happens now? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Webb leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Now you take time to process this information. You examine your motivations, your fears, and your hopes. You consider what would truly serve your healing and growth, not just what feels safe or familiar. Rodriguez stood to leave, but paused at the door. Doc, for what it's worth, I think you're ready for whatever comes next. These past few weeks have shown me someone who's finally ready to stop running from who she is. As evening approached, Sarah found herself sitting in her car in a hospital parking lot, holding David Morrison's Purple Heart and staring at the mountains that surrounded Denver. The day had shattered her carefully maintained equilibrium, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding for years. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she found a photo of David Morrison with his family, a beautiful wife, 2 young children, and a yellow Labrador retriever. They were standing in front of a magnificent sunset over Montana mountains, all of them smiling with the unself-conscious joy of people who understood the preciousness of life. The message below the photo was simple: thank you for giving me all of this. Ready to pay it forward whenever you are. Semper Fi, David. Sarah closed her eyes and, for the first time in 8 years, allowed herself to feel pride rather than guilt about her military service. The wounded could heal, but the scars told a story worth sharing. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start teaching that story to the next generation of warriors who would be called to heal in the midst of destruction. The decision had been weighing on Sarah's mind for 2 months since Colonel Morrison's visit. She had read through the training program materials countless times, researched the facility in San Diego, and even spoken with current instructors who painted a picture of meaningful work that could bridge her military and medical experience. But taking the leap still felt like stepping into an abyss where her carefully constructed civilian identity would cease to exist. Dr. Webb had been helping her work through the psychological implications of such a significant change. Their sessions had evolved from processing past trauma to exploring future possibilities, examining what it might mean to fully embrace rather than hide from her military experience. The work was challenging but necessary, forcing Sarah to confront deeply held beliefs about herself and her place in the world. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Sarah was reviewing patient charts in the break room when Dr. Martinez appeared with a concerned expression and a phone in his hand. "Sarah, I have someone on the line who specifically asked to speak with you. Says it's about a medical emergency involving a veteran and that you'd understand the significance." Sarah took the phone with a sense of foreboding. "This is Dr. Chun." The voice on the other end was young, strained with panic and exhaustion. "Doc, this is Sergeant Tom Bradley, Marines. I got your number from Chief Rodriguez. I need help, ma'am. It's about my dad." Sarah's pulse quickened. Rodriguez had been maintaining contact with various veterans in the Denver area, creating an informal network of people who might need support or assistance. The fact that this call had come through him suggested something serious. "Tell me what's happening, Sergeant," Sarah said, automatically falling into the calm, authoritative tone she had used with wounded Marines. "My dad is Mike Bradley, retired gunnery sergeant. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan, got out in 2018, been struggling ever since. Last night, he barricaded himself in his house with a rifle. Says he won't come out until he can talk to Angel 6. Sarah's blood went cold. Angel 6 had been her call sign during Operation Steel Curtain, known only to the Marines she had served with and the command structure that had coordinated the operation. The fact that this stranger's father was asking for her specifically meant that word of her location had spread through veteran networks in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Sergeant, where are you right now?" "Outside my dad's house in Aurora. SWAT is here, crisis negotiators, the whole circus. But Dad won't talk to anyone except Angel 6. Says the only person who can understand what he's going through is the corpsman who saved his squad in Helmand Province." Sarah closed her eyes, pieces of memory clicking into place. Bradley. She remembered him now, a tough, experienced gunnery sergeant who had taken shrapnel from an IED blast during a patrol in 2012. She had treated him at a forward aid station, keeping him stable until a medevac helicopter could extract him to better medical facilities. "Sergeant, I need you to give me the exact address. I'm coming out there." "Ma'am, I don't think—" "Give me the address, Marine," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect in combat zones. "Your father asked for me specifically, and I don't abandon Marines who need help." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood at a police perimeter surrounding a modest ranch house in a suburban Aurora neighborhood. The scene was exactly what Sergeant Bradley had described: SWAT vehicles, crisis negotiators, and the tense atmosphere of law enforcement personnel dealing with a potentially dangerous situation involving an armed veteran. Detective Lisa Reeves, the incident commander, briefed Sarah on the situation. "We've been here for 6 hours. Subject is Mike Bradley, 42, retired Marine with documented PTSD and depression. He's armed with an AR-15 and has made statements suggesting he doesn't intend to surrender." Sarah studied the house, noting the closed blinds and the strategic positioning of furniture visible through windows. Bradley had turned his home into a defensive position, using military tactics to control access points and maintained fields of fire. It was the behavior of someone operating on military training rather than civilian reasoning. What triggered this episode? Sarah asked. His son says he's been deteriorating for weeks. Lost his job last month. Wife filed for divorce. Got an eviction notice yesterday. Sounds like everything came crashing down at once. Sarah nodded, recognizing the pattern. Combat veterans often maintained careful psychological balance through structure and purpose. When that stability was removed, the underlying trauma could emerge with devastating force. Has anyone tried to contact him using his military call sign or referencing shared combat experience? Detective Reeves looked puzzled. His call sign. Every Marine has a radio call sign from their combat deployments. If Bradley is asking for Angel 6 specifically, he's operating in a military mindset. You need to approach him as a fellow service member, not as a civilian subject. The insight clearly hadn't occurred to the crisis negotiators. Despite their training, they were treating this as a standard hostage situation rather than a military crisis requiring specialized understanding of combat trauma and veteran psychology. Dr. Chun, Detective Reeves said, "Are you suggesting you should attempt to communicate with him?" Sarah looked at the house, considering the implications of what she was about to do. Walking into this situation would mark the end of her anonymity, the final abandonment of her attempts to separate her civilian and military identities. Every news report, every official record would identify her as the former Navy corpsman who had intervened in a veteran crisis situation. "I'm suggesting that I might be the only person here who can reach him," Sarah replied. "But I need to do this my way." Within minutes, Sarah found herself wearing a borrowed tactical vest and carrying a radio, approaching the front door of Bradley's house while SWAT snipers maintained overwatch positions. Her heart pounded with the familiar combination of fear and determination that had sustained her through countless dangerous situations in Afghanistan. "Gunny Bradley," she called out, using his military rank and the authoritative voice that had once coordinated medical evacuations under enemy fire. "This is Angel 6. You asked for me, and I'm here." The silence stretched for long minutes before Bradley's voice emerged from inside the house, muffled but clearly audible. "Angel 6? That really you, Doc? It's me, Gunny. Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Sarah Chun, attached to 3-7 Marines during your deployment to Helmand Province. I remember treating you at Forward Operating Base Chapman after your Humvee hit an ID." Another long pause, then the sound of furniture being moved. Sarah could hear Bradley repositioning himself, likely moving to a window where he could observe her while maintaining defensive cover. "You remember that day, Doc?" Sarah closed her eyes, calling up memories she had spent years trying to suppress. "I remember everything, Gunny. You had shrapnel wounds to your left side, possible internal bleeding, kept asking about your Marines, even though you were barely conscious. I remember you trying to give me your weapon because you thought you were going to die and didn't want the Taliban getting their hands on it." Jesus Christ, Bradley's voice broke with emotion. "You do remember. I remember all of it, Gunny. The good and the bad, the Marines we saved and the ones we couldn't. I remember carrying that weight for years, thinking I was the only one who understood what we went through over there." Sarah could hear movement inside the house, the sound of someone struggling with powerful emotions. She pressed on, drawing on everything Dr. Webb had taught her about processing trauma while adapting it to the unique situation of reaching a fellow veteran in crisis. "Gunny, I know why you asked for me. Because civilian therapists and crisis counselors don't understand what it's like to hold someone's life in your hands while mortars are falling. They don't understand the guilt of surviving when others didn't, or the way civilian problems feel meaningless after you've seen real suffering." "That's exactly right, Doc," Bradley replied, his voice stronger now. "My wife says I need to get over what happened in Afghanistan, like it was just a bad vacation or something. She doesn't understand that part of me never left that desert." Sarah moved closer to the house, maintaining visual contact with the SWAT commander while focusing entirely on the conversation. "Gunny, I spent 3 years trying to pretend I was just a regular civilian doctor. Thought if I could hide from my military service, I could forget the trauma and live a normal life. Did it work? No, Sarah admitted. It just made me feel more isolated, more disconnected from the person I really am. The turning point came when I realized that my combat experience wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something that made me better at helping people. She could hear Bradley moving again, this time toward the front of the house. Doc, I don't know how to live with what I've seen. How to be a civilian when part of me is still back there. You don't forget it, Gunny. You integrate it. You find ways to use what you learned over there to help people over here. The skills that kept Marines alive in Afghanistan can be used to help veterans find their way back to meaningful lives. The conversation continued for another hour, Sarah drawing on her own healing journey to help Bradley process his trauma in real time. She talked about her work with Dr. Webb, about the slow process of accepting rather than rejecting her military identity, about finding purpose that honored rather than abandoned her service. Gradually, Bradley began to open up about his specific struggles. The job loss had triggered feelings of worthlessness that connected to survivors' guilt from Afghanistan. The divorce proceedings made him feel like he was failing the Marines who had died to give him a chance at a normal life. The eviction notice represented the final collapse of the civilian identity he had tried to construct after leaving the service. Gunny, Sarah said, I want to tell you about something that happened to me recently. A few weeks ago, I met the father of a Marine I saved during Operation Steel Curtain. For 8 years, I thought I had failed that Marine because I couldn't save everyone in his unit. But it turned out he survived, got married, had kids, became a park ranger. He's living a full, meaningful life because of what I did over there. She paused, letting that sink in. The point is, I had been focusing on my failures instead of my successes. I was carrying guilt that belonged to the war, not to me personally. How do you tell the difference? You don't do it alone, Sarah replied. You work with people who understand both the military experience and the healing process. You connect with other veterans who are further along in their own journeys. You find ways to serve that give your life meaning without requiring you to forget who you were as a Marine. After another 30 minutes of conversation, Bradley agreed to come outside. Sarah watched as the front door opened slowly, revealing a man who bore the unmistakable signs of combat trauma, but also the fundamental dignity of someone who had served with honor. His hands were empty, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The arrest was handled with the respect due to a veteran in crisis, rather than the aggression typically reserved for armed subjects. Bradley was taken to the VA hospital for psychiatric evaluation and treatment, while Sarah found herself surrounded by law enforcement personnel asking questions about her background and techniques. Detective Reeves approached her as the scene was being secured. Dr. Chun, that was remarkable. We've had crisis negotiators with decades of experience who couldn't have achieved that result. Sarah felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. The conversation with Bradley had opened emotional channels she had spent years keeping closed, bringing back memories, and feeling she was still learning to process in healthy ways. Detective, I wasn't negotiating with him, Sarah explained. I was talking to a fellow veteran who needed to know he wasn't alone in carrying the weight of his experiences. The media attention was immediate and intense. By evening, local news stations were running stories about the decorated Navy medic who had successfully resolved a veteran crisis situation. The carefully maintained anonymity Sarah had cultivated for 3 years evaporated in a matter of hours. Dr. Martinez found her in his office that evening, processing the day's events while reviewing messages from reporters, veterans organizations, and military medical facilities around the country. Sarah, your phone's been ringing nonstop, he said, settling into his chair with obvious concern. Are you okay? Sarah looked up from the stack of messages, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and something that might have been relief. I think so. For the first time in years, I think I might actually be okay. The story is going national. CNN, Fox News, military publications. Everyone wants to interview the Navy corpsman who saved a fellow veteran. Your cover is completely blown. Sarah laughed, surprising herself with the sound. Good. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Martinez studied her carefully, noting the change in her demeanor. The haunted look that had characterized her for 3 years was gone, replaced by something that looked like acceptance, maybe even peace. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah picked up Colonel Morrison's contact information from her desk drawer, the packet of materials about the military medical training program that she had been avoiding for 2 months. "Now I make a phone call that I should have made weeks ago." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment with her laptop open to the application website for the Navy's combat medic training program. The words came easily now, the personal statement that had seemed impossible just hours earlier flowing from her experiences with Bradley and her own journey toward integration. She wrote about the weight of carrying lives in her hands during combat operations, about the guilt and isolation she had experienced after leaving the military, about the slow process of learning to honor rather than hide from her service. She wrote about Bradley and the realization that her skills could continue to save lives, just in different ways. Most importantly, she wrote about the responsibility that came with surviving combat when others didn't. Not the guilt of survivor syndrome, but the obligation to use that survival meaningfully, to ensure that the skills earned through trauma could be used to prevent others from experiencing the same isolation and despair. As she prepared to submit the application, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with career advancement and everything to do with finally accepting who she was. The wounded could heal, but the healing required integration rather than amputation of difficult experiences. Her phone buzzed with a text from Chief Rodriguez. "Saw the news. Document proud of you." "Ready to stop running." Sarah typed back. "Ready to start teaching." The response came immediately. "About damn time. Angel 6. For the first time in 8 years, Sarah Chun was ready to embrace rather than hide from the call sign that represented the best and worst of her military service. Angel 6 was about to teach a new generation of combat medics how to carry the weight of healing in the midst of destruction, and maybe in the process continue her own journey toward wholeness. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of 40 young Navy hospital corpsmen at the Naval Medical Training Center in San Diego, watching their faces as she prepared to deliver her first lecture on combat trauma medicine. The classroom was sterile and institutional, but the energy was electric with the anticipation of students about to learn skills that could mean the difference between life and death in combat situations. These young men and women, most barely out of high school, would soon be attached to Marine units deploying to dangerous regions around the world. They would carry the same weight Sarah had carried, make the same impossible decisions, and face the same psychological challenges that had nearly destroyed her. But unlike Sarah's generation, they would have the benefit of training based on hard-won experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chun," she began, her voice carrying the authority that had been earned through years of combat medicine and civilian practice. "But for the next 8 weeks, you'll know me as Angel 6, the call sign I carried during 3 deployments to Afghanistan as a hospital corpsman attached to 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines." The room fell silent. These students had heard stories about Angel 6, the legendary corpsman who had performed emergency surgery under enemy fire and carried wounded Marines to safety through hostile territory. Standing before them was not just an instructor, but a living example of the traditions they were preparing to carry forward. "The first thing I want you to understand," Sarah continued, "is that being a combat corpsman attached to Marine units will change you in ways that civilian medical training cannot prepare you for. You will see things, do things, and carry responsibilities that will become part of who you are for the rest of your lives." She moved away from the podium, walking among the students as she spoke. This was not going to be a sterile academic exercise, but a visceral preparation for the realities of battlefield medicine. You will hold the life of an 18-year-old Marine in your hands while mortars fall around you. You will make decisions about who to treat first when you have multiple casualties and limited resources. You will carry rifles in one hand and medical bags in the other because sometimes healing requires the ability to fight. The students shifted in their seats, some looking uncomfortable with the stark reality she was presenting. Sarah recognized their expressions, the mixture of excitement and fear that came with understanding the magnitude of what they were preparing for. But you will also experience the most profound satisfaction possible for a medical professional, Sarah said, her voice softening. You will bring Marines home to their families. You will save lives under conditions where civilian doctors would be helpless. You will be the guardian angel that stands between wounded warriors and death itself. As the lecture continued, Sarah drew on specific examples from her own experience, carefully chosen to illustrate medical procedures while conveying the psychological realities of combat medicine. She talked about treating penetrating trauma while under fire, about making rapid triage decisions with incomplete information, about maintaining focus and competence when everything around you is chaos. But she also talked about the aftermath, the guilt that could consume you if you focused only on the lives you couldn't save, the isolation that came from civilian medical practice after the intensity of combat medicine, the importance of processing trauma in healthy ways rather than burying it beneath professional facades. The skills you learn here will save lives, Sarah concluded, but they will also change you. My job is to prepare you not just medically, but psychologically for what that transformation means. After class, several students approached with questions that went beyond the curriculum. They wanted to know about the emotional challenges, about how to maintain relationships with people who couldn't understand their experiences, about how to process the weight of responsibility they were preparing to carry. Sarah found herself drawing on lessons learned from Dr. Webb, from her conversations with Chief Rodriguez, from her own painful journey toward integration. These students wouldn't have to spend years hiding from their service or struggling alone with trauma. They would have frameworks for understanding and processing their experiences from the beginning. One student, Petty Officer Amanda Martinez, lingered after the others had left. She was small in stature, but carried herself with the determined confidence of someone who had already proven herself in challenging situations. "Ma'am," Martinez said, "can I ask you about being a female corpsman attached to Marine units? I know I'm going to face challenges that the male corpsman won't." Sarah looked at this young woman who reminded her of herself 8 years earlier, determined, competent, but not yet understanding the unique obstacles she would face as a female in a predominantly male combat environment. "Petty Officer Martinez," Sarah said, "you're going to have to prove yourself every single day. Marines will test you constantly, not out of malice, but because they need to know you can perform under pressure when their lives depend on it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But once you prove yourself, once you save your first Marine under fire, you'll earn a respect that has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with competence and courage." The conversation that followed was one Sarah wished she could have had with her younger self. She talked about maintaining professional boundaries while building the trust necessary for effective medical care. She discussed the psychological armor that female combat medics needed to develop, not to become emotionally distant, but to protect themselves from the unique stresses of being a woman in combat situations. "The most important thing," Sarah said, "is to never let anyone convince you that your gender makes you less capable. Some of the best combat corpsmen I've known have been women. We bring different strengths to the battlefield, and those differences can be assets rather than liabilities." As the weeks progressed, Sarah found herself developing a teaching style that combined technical medical training with psychological preparation and emotional support. Her classroom became a place where students could ask difficult questions about fear, about moral injury, about the challenge of maintaining humanity while dealing with extreme violence. The transformation was evident in the students' confidence and competence. They were learning not just to treat combat trauma, but to understand their own psychological responses to extreme stress. They were developing the resilience that would help them survive and thrive in combat environments rather than simply endure them. Chief Rodriguez had become a regular visitor to the training center, serving as an unofficial liaison between the Corpsman Training Program and the Special Operations community. His presence provided students with another perspective on combat medicine, the view from Special Operations units that worked with corpsmen in the most dangerous situations. Doc's teaching them something we never had, Rodriguez told the program director during one of his visits. She's teaching them how to process what they're going to experience instead of just how to survive it. The observation was particularly relevant because Sarah's students were showing exceptional performance not just in medical skills, but in psychological resilience. The integration of trauma-informed training with technical medical education was producing corpsmen who were better prepared for the psychological challenges of combat medicine. 3 months into the program, Sarah received a call that brought her full circle with her decision to embrace her military identity. Mike Bradley, the veteran she had talked down from his crisis situation, was asking to speak with her. He had completed inpatient treatment at the VA hospital and was now working as a peer counselor for other veterans.